They vanished without a trace in the wild backcountry of Yosemite. Two young newlyweds who were mourned, memorialized, and long presumed dead. But 27 years later, they stepped out of the forest alive, their survival defying everything we thought we knew. How did they endure nearly 3 decades hidden in one of the most visited national parks on Earth? The summer of 1994 was one of Yosemite's busiest seasons. Families flooded the park in minivans, cameras dangled from necks, and long lines stretched across trailheads where rangers checked permits. The granite walls of El Capitan glowed golden in the evening light. Half Dome stood like a sentinel above the valley, and the rush of Yosemite Falls drowned out the chatter of tourists who gasped at its force. Among the millions who entered that year were two newlyweds, Mark and Sarah Thompson. They had driven west from Ohio in a dusty Honda Civic, their car packed with backpacks, maps, and the quiet excitement of people ready to test themselves against the wilderness. At 26 and 24, they looked like countless other young couples chasing freedom in the great American outdoors. No one suspected they were about to vanish from history. Their plan was simple: 6 days through Yosemite's high country, beginning at Tuolumne Meadows and winding into the remote backcountry. They signed the trail register like everyone else, their names scribbled in neat handwriting, a destination marked with confidence. They weren't rookies. Mark had grown up hunting and fishing in the wooded edges of the Midwest, and Sarah had spent her college years hiking through Appalachia. Together they had taken smaller trips across the Rockies and felt prepared for the Sierra Nevada. They carried a tent, freeze-dried meals, a camping stove, and bright red rain jackets folded neatly into their packs. Their friends had teased them that they looked like a catalog couple, all smiles and optimism. And for a time, that's exactly what they were. The first day on the trail was easy. The sun broke across alpine meadows painted with wildflowers, the air thin but clean, filled with the scent of pine. They passed a handful of hikers and shared waves and brief greetings, the casual camaraderie of strangers who knew they would soon vanish into their own solitude. That night, they pitched their tent beside a creek, boiled water, and ate while the stars spilled across the sky. Sarah remembered writing in her journal that night about how free she felt, how endless the world seemed when there were no highways, no clocks, just the crackle of firewood and Mark's steady breathing beside her. But on the second day, everything shifted. They spotted what looked like a shortcut, a faint track veering away from the main trail. Perhaps it was a game path made by deer. Perhaps it had once been used by shepherds long ago. Mark suggested they follow it, convinced it would curve back and save them time. Sarah hesitated, but trusted him. They stepped off the known trail and into the unknown. The path narrowed, twisted, and then descended through granite boulders slick with condensation from the morning air. At one point, Sarah slipped, wrenching her ankle against the stone. It wasn't broken, but it slowed her down, forcing her to lean on Mark as they pressed forward. They expected to rejoin the main trail by afternoon. Instead, they found themselves at the edge of a hidden valley, a bowl cut deep into the granite, rimmed by sheer cliffs and waterfalls. The walls rose hundreds of feet, sealing them inside. Their map showed nothing of this place. Their compass needle wavered strangely, as though the rock itself confused it. With Sarah limping and daylight fading, they decided to make camp. Mark built a fire. Sarah wrapped her ankle and bit back tears. They promised each other it was only a detour. By tomorrow, they would climb back out. But tomorrow came, and the cliffs offered no easy exit. When they didn't appear at their scheduled checkpoints, rangers assumed they were simply delayed. But as days passed, worry spread. Search teams combed trails, helicopters buzzed overhead, and volunteers scanned canyons with binoculars. Flyers with their faces appeared at ranger stations and camp stores. Their families called repeatedly, voices strained with dread. The search continued for weeks. No trace was found. No discarded gear, no torn fabric, not even footprints in the soil. Yosemite is vast, and it had swallowed them whole. Summer turned to autumn, autumn to winter. Snow fell heavy across the Sierra, erasing whatever faint signs may have existed. The rangers eventually suspended the search. The Thompsons were listed as missing. Memorial services were held back home in Ohio, where parents wept and pastors spoke of young lives cut short. Gravestones were erected, their names etched into marble. For most, the story ended there. But inside that granite bowl, cut off from all the world's eyes, Mark and Sarah's lives were just beginning a very different chapter, one that no one would believe for nearly 3 decades. The first weeks inside the hidden valley were filled with desperation. Mark attempted to scale the cliffs, searching for a handhold or ledge, but each attempt ended in failure. His hands blistered. His body scraped raw against the stone. Sarah tried to stay hopeful, but every night she felt the walls close tighter, the silence heavier. Their supplies dwindled fast. Freeze-dried meals vanished. Matches ran out. Batteries in their small flashlight dimmed. By the end of the first month, the couple was living off what the valley provided. A narrow stream trickling from a snow melt above, patches of edible roots and berries, and the occasional trout Mark caught with crude lines fashioned from shoelaces. Hunger sharpened them, forced them to adapt. They built their first shelter from pine branches and flat granite slabs, clumsy but enough to block wind and rain. They lined the floor with ferns and moss, their scent sharp in the cold air. At night, Sarah's ankle throbbed and she shivered beneath their shared sleeping bag, but Mark wrapped his arms around her and whispered that they would make it. In the mornings, they gathered water and fished. In the afternoons, they foraged. They learned which berries sickened them, which roots provided strength. Every mistake carried a cost. Every misstep a risk of injury they could not afford. Yet slowly, they carved out a routine. The years passed in a blur of seasons. Summers baked the valley, the granite shimmering with heat, insects buzzing endlessly. Winters turned it into a frozen prison, snow piling against the shelter, air so cold their breath hung like smoke. During the lean months, they rationed what little they had, chewing pine bark to trick their stomachs. They stitched clothes from animal hides, the seams uneven but functional, using needles made of sharpened bone. Their skin tanned and weathered, their hair grew long and silvered. They looked less like lost tourists and more like relics from another century. Emotionally, the burden was heavier still. In the early years, Sarah dreamed of rescue. She would look to the skies at every sound of thunder, half imagining it was the hum of a helicopter. She wrote notes on scraps of paper from her old journal, stashing them in cracks of the cliff in hopes someone might someday find them. Mark tried to distract her with plans for escape, with talk of how they'd build a better shelter, how they'd plant food near the stream. But he too carried moments of despair, nights when he lay awake staring into the dark, wondering if the world above even remembered their names. Love kept them alive. They argued sometimes over food, over risks, over whether they should keep trying to climb out. But every argument ended the same way, with an embrace, with whispered apologies, with a shared conviction that they only had each other. That bond became their greatest survival tool. When Sarah broke down crying, Mark reminded her of her strength. When Mark grew silent and withdrawn, Sarah forced him to speak, to laugh, to hope. Together they endured. As the 90s bled into the 2000s, they had no way of knowing how the world outside had changed. Technology advanced. Wars began and ended. Entire generations grew up never hearing their story. In Yosemite, millions of visitors hiked within miles of their hidden valley, snapping photos of Half Dome and floating down the Merced River. None suspected that 2 missing people were alive just beyond the cliffs, eking out an existence in silence. The Thompsons lived in a world frozen in time, measuring life not by clocks or calendars but by the slow rhythm of seasons, by the thaw of snow and the bloom of wildflowers, by the tightening hunger of winter and the relief of spring. For 27 years, they remained ghosts in the granite, kept alive by instinct, determination, and the fierce refusal to surrender. They had become part of the wilderness itself, hidden in plain sight within one of the most visited national parks on Earth. And when the world finally found them again, it would struggle to comprehend what they had endured. By the summer of 2021, the Sierra Nevada wore the color of thirst. Snowpack melted early, creeks thinned to threads, and rangers pushed deeper into the backcountry to test new water sources and map dry tributaries that hadn't been surveyed in years. A 3-person team moved along a ravine south of Tuolumne, the air resin-sweet and hot, granite radiating warmth through their boot soles. The GPS showed a shallow V in the contours, a hint of a narrow valley that older maps treated like blank space. Brush closed over the trail until there was no trail at all, just manzanita snagging pant legs and the steady rasp of wind. Then one of them stopped and pointed. A pale ribbon of smoke drifted where no campsite should be. They approached cautiously at first, assuming an illegal fire. The ravine pinched into a hallway of stone, the temperature dropping as shadow gathered. The smoke smell shifted from sharp to faintly savory, as if meat had been cooked and then removed from heat long ago. A scatter of fish bones gleamed in dust near a flat slab of rock blackened by years of use. The clearing was tidy, not the signature mess of a careless hiker. And then two figures stepped from the trees as if carved out of bark and sunlight. A man and a woman, their hair long and gray, their skin a map of sun and years. Their clothes were stitched from hides and scraps of old fabric. Their eyes were clear. "Hello," the man said, as if he hadn't used the word in a long time. His voice wavered and then steadied. "We don't mean trouble." The team leader lifted both hands, palms out, every protocol of backcountry contact flashing through training. Names were offered carefully, like precious objects. The man said his name was Mark. He gestured to the woman beside him. "Sarah." The ranger repeated the names, something tugging in memory, and then pulled a tablet from a pack, fingers typing with growing urgency. The screen bloomed with two faces from a different century. The same faces, younger, smiling in a park register photo dated 1994. Breath snagged in throats. Radios crackled. The protocol shifted from illegal camp to medical evacuation so fast the air seemed to pulse. The rangers spoke softly, offering water, offering packets of food with labels that looked like a foreign alphabet to people who had not seen brands in decades. Mark and Sarah took the water first, sipping as if relearning the action, eyes darting between the unfamiliar gear and the familiar granite walls. Questions came slowly. How long? Where had they been? Were they hurt? The answers were simple and staggering. Years. Here. Scars and aches. But nothing that could be fixed with a single bandage. The canyon that hid them also complicated rescue. Rotor wash in a slot like this could whip a helicopter sideways, turn gravel into shrapnel. The team called for a hoist-capable ship and, while they waited, set about doing the most important work, stabilizing two people who had survived too long to be treated like a rushed extraction. Space blankets unfurled with soft crackles. Warm layers were offered. Salt packets, sips of electrolyte solution, slow calories. A drone's buzz announced an overflight. Its camera relayed images to a command post sprinting into existence 15 miles away. Someone there pulled the old case file and whispered the word miracle without irony. The first helicopter pass rattled the canyon like a drum. Mark flinched at the sound, instinct burying him deeper into the sheltering rock. Sarah shielded her eyes and stared up at the machine that looked like an insect against a slice of sky. The pilots circled, testing the air, before peeling away to confer with the hoist team. Ground rescuers moved closer, ropes coiled at their hips, helmets tapping gently against packs. They rehearsed the moves in clipped phrases, mapping where a litter could anchor, where a belay might catch a swing if the wind shoved too hard. Time stretched. Heat pooled on the rock and then began to drain as the sun slipped behind the rim. When the ship returned, the air turned to vibration. The hoist line stitched a thin, quivering line between earth and sky. A rescuer slid down that thread and landed light on stone, a second following with a litter. They crouched, faces open, voices pitched low to nestle under the noise. The plan split the couple. Sarah first, the lighter of the two and the more visibly fatigued, then Mark. The litter straps crossed her chest with a firm kindness. As the line took tension, she clenched Mark's hand and closed her eyes. Dust rose to veil everything in sepia. For a heartbeat she hovered, a leaf on an invisible stream. And then she rose, the canyon's narrow sky widening around her until the ship swallowed her into its metal belly. Mark watched the point where she disappeared until his eyes watered. When the line returned, he nodded once and let them work. The lift jolted harder for him. A gust shoved the litter, and the belay team braced against the swing, ropes humming like plucked wires. Gravel skittered. A small rock cut a white line down the wall and bounced harmlessly into scrub. Then he too was rising, the world he had known shrinking to a small, ordered circle of fire pit and shelter and stream. the years collapsing into a single vertical motion. The rotor slap crescendoed, and the canyon fell away like a held breath finally exhaled. In the helicopter's cabin, light turned stark and loud. Sarah blinked against it, the thrum of engines threading through her bones. Gloved hands checked pulse, blood pressure, pupils. A blanket tucked at shoulders sent a warmth almost painful in its generosity. Mark's litter slid in and latched with a metallic certainty. Their fingers found each other's again, a small island amid equipment and efficiency. A flight medic offered a smile that said everything words could not. The valley below unfolded in ridges and rivers, a geography they had learned 1 square yard at a time now, revealed in one impossible glance. The landing zone on the park's edge smelled of dust and hot metal. Ambulances waited, doors yawning open. The first hospital room felt like an artifact from a civilization they half remembered. White sheets glowed. A monitor beeped with metronomic indifference. A nurse's badge winked with a photo and a barcode. They ate broth like children, one careful spoon at a time, savored the clean sweetness of tap water that ran without boiling or worry. Doctors took blood, marveled at bone density hardened by labor, cataloged old fractures that had mended without casts, sun damage etched like a diary on skin. A social worker explained gently, over hours, that years had passed beyond what they could count by season alone. Night came with a different kind of silence, one padded by HVAC and hallway wheels, a silence with edges softened by civilization. Sleep arrived and broke and arrived again, a tide against an unfamiliar shore. In the morning, faces at the door carried the caution of people approaching history. Camera crews were kept away by a polite wall of policy, the story already leaking into the world through radio chatter and inevitable awe. The Park Service released only what they had to. 2 missing hikers from 1,994 had been found alive, names withheld pending family notification. The phone tree began to tremble 3 states away. The call reached a small kitchen in Ohio, where a gray-haired man stared at the wall and whispered a name he hadn't said aloud in years. He was Mark's younger brother, his own children grown now. The framed graduation photos sharing space with a sun-faded missing poster he had never quite had the courage to take down. The ranger on the line spoke slowly, words chosen with care, and the man sat down hard, one hand on the table, as if the house had shifted under him. The drive to the airport blurred. The flight west unspooled as a procession of clouds and old memories he had packed away and labeled unsolvable. In the hospital, the first meeting collapsed decades in a single step. Mark and his brother clung to each other, eyes wet, the soft surprise of a familiar laugh breaking and returning like light through leaves. Sarah's embrace was quieter, grief and gratitude braided too tightly to separate. News of parents already gone was a second loss that day, an ache that found its own chair at the bedside and did not leave. A chaplain offered space for tears and did not fill it with words. The staff moved around this reunification like a tide around a rock, steady, respectful, the practical world carrying on its practical business while something rare stitched itself back together in plain sight. Re-entry did not arrive as a single door thrown wide, but as a sequence of small thresholds. The first shower lasted forever and ended too soon. Hot water, a benediction that made their skin prickle with overwhelmed nerves. A closet of donated clothes turned out to be a museum of fabrics that stretched and wicked and breathed in ways unfamiliar. Shoes felt strange on feet that had learned the shape of stone. Someone handed Mark a smartphone and he flinched when it woke at his touch, their reflections nested in its glass like ghosts. A volunteer placed a bowl of plums on the bedside table, and Sarah ate one in reverent bites, juice sweet and shocking, the color lush as sunset. They were debriefed by patient voices from the Park Service, questions staged over days rather than hours. Where had they lived precisely? How had they avoided contact for so long? The canyon remained unnamed in public releases to protect it from curiosity that could trample what had protected them. The couple sketched maps from memory, fingers tracing the contour of a stream that knew their footsteps, the lean-to's evolution from fragile hut to stout shelter, the berry thickets and the winter caches and the talus slope that never quite held a man's weight. Biologists leaned forward, minds humming at the data embedded in human memory. Rescuers listened for lessons they could carry to the next impossible call. Therapists joined the circle gently, offering language for a body that had run on survival chemistry for decades. Sleep came in patches at first. The hospital too, still in the wrong ways. Too loud in others. The beeps and the wheels and the midnight laughter down the corridor felt like an alien forest. Mark woke at the hiss of an oxygen line and flinched at a custodian's rolling cart that sounded like falling scree. Sarah wept when a fire alarm test clawed at her spine. Memories unspooling in bright, unbidden frames. Breathing exercises were taught. Windows were cracked for pine-scented air. Discharge planning included not just dietary guidance and dermatology referrals, but a soft scaffold of counseling woven through the weeks ahead. Outside, the story galloped. Headlines burned with words like miraculous and unbelievable. Old case files were pulled and dusted. Reporters stood at park gates with careful empathy and barely leashed hunger. The Park Service kept its boundary. Friends who had married, moved, grown kids, and settled mortgages wrote letters instead of requests for selfies. Some letters were apologies for funerals held too early. Some were confessions of hope that had never quite gone out. The couple read them in quiet, sometimes together, sometimes alone. The pages growing damp where tears gathered and fell. They did not move back to Ohio. Instead, they settled for a time in the foothills, where the land rose toward the granite they knew by the names they had given it. A small rental with a porch became a way station between worlds. Waking at dawn, they sat with mugs that steamed in cool air and watched light climb the flanks of distant ridges. A familiar ceremony, anchored by the unfamiliar luxury of a kettle that boiled at a twist of the wrist. Groceries were an astonishment, aisles that felt like rivers of color and choice. They learned the choreographies of crosswalks again, the logic of traffic that obeyed signs instead of seasons. A neighbor's dog decided they were his and leaned against their legs with the gravity of an old friend. There were public moments that mattered, and private ones that mattered more. On a quiet weekday, escorted by rangers who had become family, they returned to the park by road. They did not go to the hidden canyon. The route was too dangerous, and the secrecy too precious to burn with footsteps. Instead, they stood at an overlook where the valley lay clean and green, granite shouldering the sky, the river throwing a ribbon of light through trees. They held hands and said nothing for a long time. When they finally spoke, it was to thank the place that had both held and hidden them, to thank the people who had never stopped training for a day like the one that had lifted them out, to thank each other for the stubbornness that had kept them breathing when breath felt like a finite resource. They agreed to one interview, done in a room without bright lights, no makeup, no rehearsed questions. The interviewer asked what anyone would ask. How did you do it? What kept you going when the winters pressed down and the summers baked the world dry? Sarah looked at her hands for a long time before she answered. We kept a calendar without numbers, she said. Snow, thaw, blossom, fruit, lean. We learned the language of a place, and it learned ours. And we did not let go of each other. Mark nodded and added that survival had been an accumulation of small decisions, none grand, all necessary. Boil water, mend a seam, try again tomorrow. Hope can be as practical as a good knot. There were missteps. The first time they sat in a crowded restaurant, the room's noise folded over them like weather, and they had to step outside, hands at their ribs, hearts racing. The first time a drone buzzed overhead on a neighbor's lawn, Mark had to sit on the porch steps and breathe until the past let go of his throat. Therapy helped. Time helped. A garden helped more than both. Hands in soil convincing the body that new roots could hold. They wrote letters to families with missing loved ones. Letters that did not promise impossible endings but offered solidarity from the long interior of uncertainty. They consulted with rangers on backcountry safety stories that could reach people who believed their maps were invincible. They asked that the canyon remain unmarked on official publications, a request honored without debate. Some places repay secrecy with grace. Some stories become talismans not because they are repeated loudly, but because they are carried quietly, close to the heart. On an evening brushed with gold, they stood in the soft racket of crickets and watched the moon climb the shoulder of a pine. The porch boards held their weight. The world they had left had not waited for them, but it had made a little room. Love had stretched across years and then across miles, unspooling a bridge they could walk without looking down. When they finally turned in, the house breathed with them, a companionable sound, and the future, which had been a rumor for so long, settled like a blanket warm enough to imagine morning.